If I'm going to understand how a society works, capturing this, how do people live together in difference, is the salient issue. What does it feel like to be a citizen of China, but also to be a little bit different from your neighbor, your non-Muslim neighbor? China is a much more geographically and socially diverse place than the United States. Literally, in the province that I study, you can go 30 miles and you can encounter people who speak an entirely different language from you. They practice a different religion from you. And so learning how people negotiate those differences, but also they're all in this together, right? They are all citizens. They are part of the state. If you ask any of those people, who are you? They will identify themselves at a number of different levels. They will say, I'm absolutely a citizen of the People's Republic of China, but I'm also a citizen of this local town. I belong to this family that has a generational history going back, decades, if not centuries. I'm also a member of this particular faith community, whether that's Muslim, Buddhist, Taoist, what have you. People have this view that Americans are all the same, right? But we're not, are we? Some of you students live in, communities of 10 people. Some of you live where you're close in a location where your closest neighbor is 30 miles away. Then some of you have come here from Los Angeles, right? Living, on top of each other virtually. And you practice different religious traditions. You have different family histories. You have different histories of migration to the United States for the most part. It's interesting, whenever I talk to Americans and I ask them, how do you see the Chinese people? I get this uniform response. It's always, well, they're all Chinese. So there's no recognition of living together in difference. But what's really interesting is when I go to China and I ask that same question to my Chinese friends, I get the same response. Oh, Americans are all the same. America is all the same. Because the image that the people in China have of America comes from the media. And what do they see? When they think of America, they see Los Angeles or New York. Well, I happen to live in a state of Wyoming, which is quite different, and I bring them photographs of this place. So I think it's really important for all of us, if we're going to understand how the other side of the world operates, it's really important to understand, people are different, but we're all in this together. So I'm a historian, but I also really see myself as an area specialist, which is a little bit different. An area specialist, by definition, is somebody whose primary training is in the languages. So you can actually go read the documents in their original languages. You can go and talk to people without the need of a translator going with you and holding your hand. It's also a slightly different focus than a historian. An area specialist is really concerned about the whole history and contemporary context, not just a narrow slice of history. So my research bleeds into a number of areas. Obviously, it speaks to the history of imperial China. It speaks to religious studies. Religion is one of these fraught topics across China. Now, let's be clear about something. The Chinese Constitution guarantees the right for all citizens to practice their religion, okay? So it's not as if religion is outlawed in China, and the Chinese authorities are especially sensitive when foreigners come in and are asking questions about Islam. When the People's Republic of China was formed in 1949, one of the very first things that the leadership had to do was figure out who lived in China. And they knew that there were a lot of non-Chinese people living across China. And one of the reasons they went on this project of identifying minority groups across China was because they needed the cooperation of those people if they were going to form a nation, right? And out of that national minority identification project, they came up with an eventual list of 55 separate, officially recognized national minority groups who live in China. Of those 55 groups, 10 of those groups are Muslims. By that very identity or that label, they are kind of set apart from Chinese, who are the majority ethnically. So they form an important part of the Chinese social fabric. And it's important to understand how they live, where they live, how they interact with Chinese people. You know, that there's a whole gamut of questions that need to be better understood outside of China. I would also say within China, there are a lot of misperceptions about Muslims by Chinese people, non-Muslim Chinese people. And so, you know, part of the thing that I think is part of my task as a historian, and maybe more and more as a cultural anthropologist, is to try and bridge that gap. Even though I'm not adequately prepared to do that because I am not Chinese, right? So I always bring in an outsider's perspective. But sometimes that can be a useful counter-narrative to the dominant discourse that's floating around in the country. Whenever I go to China and I do this kind of in situ research, I always do it with a local collaborator. That's really important. And I've had people come up and tell me, you know, had you not come along with your Chinese Muslim friend, I wouldn't have spoken to you. And there are a number of reasons for that, one of which is ethnicity and religion. They're kind of sensitive topics in China, and you want to get the cooperation of the local people. And if I were just to show up on my own, even though I speak Chinese, it's not the same as having an introduction from somebody who's trusted in the local community. It's a great culture to do historical research. And so I work on 13th, 14th century China. That's my first area of research. And there are just, you know, reams of primary sources, a lot of which nobody's ever really worked with, even inside China. Most people neglect this period of time. But I'm also interested in studying about China from a contemporary point of view, because China is a really interesting and critically important part of the world. All you have to do is read the newspaper to know that the Chinese economy is a major part of the world economy. The ups and downs in the Chinese economy on a day-by-day basis have very real ramifications back here. For example, in the state of Wyoming, China is decreasing its consumption of coal. Well, if you know anything about what's going on in the state of Wyoming right now, you know that coal prices are in the tank, and it's partly because of China. So there are a whole number of reasons that China, the study of China is interesting and vital, I would say, as an American and as a historian. Teaching informs research, research informs teaching. And they go really nicely hand in hand together. Because really, we have to take our educational mission seriously, especially at a place like the University of Wyoming. We're a research university, but we're also a land-grant university. And it's really important to take that educational mission, you know, and bring it out to the people of the state. Last week, I went with the director of the Institute over to Eastern Wyoming Community College and gave a talk. It was a more general talk on citizenship and religion in the People's Republic of China. But it's based, a lot of the talk was based on research that I did this past summer. I think that was really hugely important. It was an impressive audience. Over 70 people, a really good cross-section of public and students and faculty, and it was a very lively Q&A. Scholarly research and writing is a very arcane kind of production, and that's important for me as a scholar, somebody who's in the field, but it's equally important for me to try to get this information out to the more general public. And because I'm an educator, first and foremost, I'm an educator, even more than a researcher. Or maybe I should say those two identities are at sort of the same level. But as an educator, I feel it's really incumbent upon me to take the knowledge that I have generated out of my research, which has been funded by generous grants like WIHR, and to make that accessible to the general public. Now, you have to understand something. Historians are used to working on very little amounts of money. So what we need to go and do research is a drop in the bucket compared to my colleagues in the physical sciences who need all sorts of fancy equipment. But we do need to get over there, right? We need, I'm going to China next week on a short research trip, so I need, you know, $1,000 to get there and to live for a week or two. So yeah, none of this research would have been possible had it not been for those kinds of grant opportunities. The funding that comes out of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research is really critical, especially for those of us in the so-called humanities writ large.